Okay, so today we're going to do the renal lab. So you remember you have a video of Miss Graham showing you everything, and then me kind of going a little more detail on the PowerPoint. So urinary lab, this portion is going to cover the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. So looking at a torso, we see our two kidneys, 1 and 2. We know our left from our right, correct? Make sure you do. So your right side, left side. So that's always a question. Make sure you can do left and right. So this is where the urine is made. These little yellow things are the adrenal glands right above there. So you have your kidneys, your ureters. That's where the urine is going to flow from the kidney on the left and the right side to the bladder. And then from the bladder, it will exit the body through the urethra. Okay, so those are the 4 main portions of the kidney. And then we're going to do some details on these organs as well. So to see that on a model, this is a torso model. And so one thing about the kidney and the renal system is it's retroperitoneal, which means it's behind the peritoneal cavity. So inside the abdominal cavity, there's kind of an area with a peritoneal sac, which contains all of the digestive organs, small intestine, large intestine, stomach, and things like that. You have a visceral peritoneum and a parietal peritoneum. Remember all that back from 201? And so this is all behind that. It's not inside that sac. So you have your kidney here. So this is going to be one kidney. And you can see it's behind this part of the small intestine. So it's behind that digestive organ. And there's another one peeking out behind the pancreas. So it's kind of hidden behind the pancreas. So these are along the back wall of the abdominal cavity. Okay. Here is a ureter coming down here and here. So you have your left and your right ureters. And then here is the bladder. And obviously these are going to connect. It's just they're cut away on this model. Now to see the urethra, we need to actually look inside the models. So here's another model where we've just taken out pretty much the urinary system. And so you can see your kidney, and this is a kidney with a cutaway to see inside of it. Here's a ureter, here's a ureter, and here is a bladder. And you can see the urethra right here. Now, they don't look the same in males and females, so you've got to remember I could test you on the urinary system in a male or a female. Okay, so let's look at these in detail. So this is a what? This is a female. And so this is the bladder, correct? No, that's the uterus. So here's your bladder right here. Okay, here's the ureter coming down, and then this tube is the urethra. Okay, now you can also see a little bit on these models some sphincter muscles. In order to release urine from the bladder to void, there is kind of a sphincter muscle that's called your internal sphincter. And some books say that there isn't, and some books say that there is. So we're just going to say that there is. I mean, because it's kind of funny. There's some question about that. So some books say yes, some books say no. But the involuntary portion that kind of has to relax to let you void is going to be right at the base of the bladder where it connects to the uppermost portion of the urethra. And then the lower sphincter, the external urethral sphincter, is going to be part of the pelvic floor. And it's going to open and close at the base of the urethra. Okay, so in the female, it would be, the internal would be kind of in this area, and the external would be generally in this area. Okay. This is a male. So again, here's your ureter coming down. Okay, here's your bladder again. So the urine will be inside here. And this is just the muscle wall of the bladder. It actually can contract. Same in the female. There's a muscular wall, that smooth muscle that forms the bladder because it will contract and spasm. Here would be where the internal sphincter would be. This long tube is the urethra. And then again, your external sphincter is in the floor of the pelvic wall. Okay, so you'll notice that the urethra is much longer in the male after it exits the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. So some anatomy of the kidney. This is one single kidney, and so I've tried to list the structures that you need to know. I'll also have a sheet that has all your structures on there as well. We'll talk about it with this picture, then we'll look at it on an actual model. So the outermost part of the kidney is called the renal capsule, and then just deep to that is this outermost layer, this pink layer, which is called the renal cortex, and then deep to that are these darker shaded areas called the renal medulla. Okay, so the outside of the organ, kind of beneath the capsule, is called the cortex, and the inside is called the medulla. Now, the cortex also invaginates down in through the kidney. So where you see it kind of go, this color pink kind of going down like that, these are called renal columns. So the renal columns are just kind of where the cortex kind of goes down into the kidney. And between those columns, what that does is separate these brown areas with the medulla, and they're shaped like a pyramid. So we call them renal pyramids. So these kind of triangular shaped areas are called your renal pyramids, and they make up the medulla. You also have your renal artery and renal vein, so your artery and vein. We've learned that before, so anything you've learned previous is always fair game on a future test. So that's your blood supply. The vessels are going to divide, and become smaller and smaller. The only smaller arteries and veins you've got to know for this particular one is the interlobular arteries and veins. So these renal pyramids kind of make lobes, and so these interlobular arteries and veins are going to go around these renal pyramids. You also have, let me do the eraser. There's a lot on here, okay? You also have what are called the renal pelvis and the calyx or calyces. Calyx is singular, calyces is plural. So the ureter, the urine is going to leave the kidney and go to the bladder via the ureter. So there's a cup that basically collects the urine as it's being produced in the kidney. All the urine drains to the central portion, this very, very center part of the kidney. And this large cup is called the renal pelvis. And what happens is smaller and smaller cups, okay, I'm going to change the word here in a minute, are going to drain to this portion of the kidney, this renal pelvis. So if you look at this renal pyramid, okay, the urine flow is going to go like that. And it's going to drain into this little cup, and that's called a minor calyx. Okay? And if you look here, here's a minor calyx, and here's a minor calyx. Well, when two minor calyces come together, it forms a larger calyx called a major calyx. Okay? And if you take this major calyx and that major calyx and this major calyx, and they all drain to this central area called the renal pelvis. Okay? So each medulla has this renal pyramid. Each renal pyramid drains to a minor calyx. Several minor calyxes join to form major calyces, and then these major calyces join together to form the renal pelvis. Okay, so urine's just collecting in those progressively bigger cups before it can drain to the ureter. All right. We also know that the functional part of the kidney is called the nephron. This is where urine is actually made. So this would be one of your arteries. These arteries are going to finally divide. They get smaller, smaller, smaller until they finally make an arteriole. So this is called the afferent arteriole. Okay, and it exits as the efferent arteriole. So the afferent and efferent arterioles. Well, between the afferent and efferent arterioles, it forms a capillary. Okay, and this is where the blood is actually filtered, and you get the beginnings of the urine formation. So this capillary is called a glomerulus. And surrounding that glomerulus, there's got to be a place to catch that filtrate. This outside, this kind of brown structure around it is the glomerular capsule. So those two structures together is called the renal corpuscle. So you have the renal corpuscle, which is made up of the glomerulus, which is a capillary bed that is formed from the afferent arteriole and then drains back to the efferent arteriole. The urine, the first steps of urine formation are going to be collected in this glomerular capsule. And then this filtrate is going to be processed before it finally becomes urine. It's not urine until it really gets to the very end. It's going to travel through the nephron. And the first place it goes is this twisty bendy thing called a proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, then it's going to go through what's called the loop of Henle. And so there's a thin section, and then there's a thick section. As it's going down, we call it the descending limb, and it's going back up, we call it the ascending limb. So you can see the ascending limb has a thin portion and a thick portion. Okay? Once it leaves the loop of Henle, it's going to make another twisty bendy thing called the distal convoluted tubule. And then these distal convoluted tubules, these are from several different nephrons, will all kind of coalesce together and form this large thing called a collecting duct. And this is going to be where the urine is, and it's going to then drain to the renal, the calyces, and then finally the renal pelvis. Now, one thing to get straight about proximal versus distal, this has nothing to do with arms and legs. Okay, it's proximal and distal when you're referring to the glomerulus. So the part of the nephron that's closest to the glomerulus, the first twisty-bendy thing, is the proximal one, and the one that's furthest away, as in urine flow, not physically. Okay, the distal convoluted tubule smashed right up against the glomerulus. We're talking about in distance of the filtrate moving through the nephron. Let me do my eraser again. So remember, urine flow is this is going to be how it flows through here. So as the urine is closest to the glomerulus, that's the proximal convoluted tubule, and as it travels and becomes further away from the glomerulus in distance as far as inside the tube, that's called the distal convoluted tubule. I hope that made sense. And the reason I want you to get to in your mind that somehow the distal convoluted tubule is somehow separated by space is that actually the distal convoluted tubule comes back to its own glomerulus. Okay, I know I just blew your mind, but just wait a minute and you'll see it in just a second. All right, so here's one of the models. So you have here's your adrenal gland, your cortex and medulla. So you have the brown, the renal capsule. You have this pink part called the renal cortex, with these renal columns. You have the renal medulla, which are all these little triangular shaped portions. You can see how it forms a pyramid. So that's called a renal pyramid. The tips of the renal pyramids are called the renal papilla. Let me spell that for you. P-A-P-I-L-L-A-E. The renal papilla are the little tips of the renal medullas. And this is where this area here, this is where all the collecting tubules come together, and then the urine can drain into this cup, which is called a minor calyx. Okay? So you can see the ureter is going to be right here. Here is the renal pelvis, and you can see some of these cups. Here's a minor one, here's a minor one, and they're going to form a major one. Here's a minor one, forming a major calyx, and these are going to drain into the renal pelvis. You have your renal artery, your renal vein on this model. If you blow it up, you can see, again, the capsule. Here's the cortex. Here's the column. Here's a renal pyramid that ends in this thing called a renal papilla. And all these white things are nephrons. So you can see, here's the afferent arteriole going in, and you see that little red capillary inside there. The yellow dots are going to be the glomerular capsules. And you can see the urine is then going to flow. So on this one, this is the proximal convoluted tubule. It goes to the loop of Henle, and then this would be the distal convoluted tubule. It's going to go to the collecting duct. On this one, this side is the proximal convoluted tubule, goes through the loop of Henle, and this would be the distal convoluted tubule draining into the collecting duct. Okay, so don't get in your mind that proximal convoluted tubules are on the left or the right. Find your glomerulus and then trace your nephron. The part of the nephron that's close to the glomerulus as the filtrate's moving through is proximal. The last part before it gets to the collecting tubule is distal. Because remember, the distal convoluted tubule comes back to its own glomerulus. So what you're seeing right here is the beginning of the distal convoluted tubule. And it comes and forms something called the JGA, juxtaglomerular apparatus. And you'll see this in lecture. And this is where there's some sensors that allow you to measure things like sodium content and things like that, and figure out if you need to change the speed of urine formation. Again, you're going to get the physiology of that later. So this is the glomerulus. So here's your afferent arteriole coming in. It's thicker than the efferent. This is going to be the efferent arteriole. So blood flows in here, and this capillary, these red capillaries, they're coated in cells called podocytes. So these brown things are called podocytes. Okay, so then you can see a space in here. This is the glomerular space So the glomerular space is the area that's going to collect that filtrate inside the glomerular capsule. So the glomerular capsule is going to surround the glomerulus, and there's a space in there that's going to catch the filtrate, which is going to be the beginnings of urine. That filtrate will then travel in the tube, and this is the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay. Now you can go online, go to Google, and you can just type in kidney model, and you can see all kind of kidney models. They're the same as ours, and you can see some even ones that are even labeled in more detail than what I'm doing. So you can definitely take advantage of the Google looking at that. All right. If you'll know on my test, I use a mixture of diagrams and models because we don't necessarily have a model of everything. So one of the things we're going to look at is the blood supply of this part of the kidney. So remember, you have blood coming in, these smaller and smaller arteries, and it's going to form that afferent arteriole right here, make that glomerulus, and that's the first capillary bed. What's cool about the kidney is you actually have two capillary beds in succession before you get back to the venule. Okay, so it's arteriole, capillary, capillary, venule. So it's kind of different than what you've learned before. So the glomerulus is the first capillary. The second capillary is going to be surrounding the nephron, okay? And it's called a peritubular capillary. Okay, so this purple stuff, that's the second capillary bed. Then that joins back into the venule. Okay, so it goes arteriole, capillary bed, venule. Now there's actually two types of capillaries that make that second set of capillaries. You have peritubular capillaries. That's when the capillary is around the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule, and the distal convoluted tubule. And then if you have a second capillary bed that goes around the loop of Henle, we call that the vasa recta. So this one would have a glomerulus as the first capillary bed, and the second capillary bed is the vasa recta, which is going, surrounding that loop of Henle. And when you learn about urine formation, you'll understand the importance of these capillary beds. They allow movement of salt and water and other things between the nephron and the blood supply. Another thing about the nephrons is they're not all created equal. Some are kind of short, and they're found more in the cortical region. So this is an example of a cortical nephron. And some are going to be a little lower in the cortex, but they have long loops of Henle that go way down into the medulla. These are going to be for helping you concentrate urine. These are called juxtamedullary nephrons. So you have a mixture of cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Your cortical nephrons will have these peritubular capillaries. Your juxtamedullary nephrons will have the vasa recta. Okay, so vasa means vessel, recta means straight. So kind of these straight vessels surrounding the loop of Henle. All right, so another image of the models. Here's one. Again, you can see the capsule, you can see the cortex, you can see the renal medulla. It's going to end in the papilla at the end. You can see the little calyx. There's another calyx, and it's all going to join the renal pelvis. And you can start to see these collecting ducts, and you can see nephrons here. Okay, so we're going to blow that up and look at a little blown up vision of the nephron. This long thing is the collecting tubule. Okay, so we know that the distal convoluted tubule connects to the collecting tubule. So we know that's going to be distal convoluted tubule. All right, so when you're looking at these models, again, make sure you start at the glomerulus. Otherwise, you're going to get proximal distal convoluted tubule backwards. It's pretty easy to get loop of Henle. I mean, that's, they're the big U-bend, hairpin shaped things. But to figure out proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule, you've got to start at the glomerular capsule and pretend your urine flowing through the tubule. So the first place you flow through is proximal convoluted tubule. Go through the loop of Henle, and then you go through the distal convoluted tubule. On this one, here's the glomerulus. The first place you go is proximal convoluted tubule. Go through the loop of Henle, and then this last bendy part is the distal convoluted tubule as it goes to the collecting duct. Okay, so I'll try to have these blown up really big on the images for your exam. So just trace it from the glomerulus, proximal convoluted tubule, loop, distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct. Again, here's another view of the glomerular capsule, glomerular space, and glomerulus. So the big thick vessel going in is the afferent arteriole. The smaller one is the efferent arteriole. Here's the glomerulus. Remember, it's covered in those cells called podocytes. which act as a filtration, kind of a sieve. You'll learn more about that in your lab. Here's the glomerular space, which is going to collect the filtrate, which is going to become urine. This is called the glomerular capsule, and then this is going to be the proximal convoluted tubule. I'm trying to think if I left anything out of that. All right, and then right here, get my eraser again. It's really not all that complicated. It seems like it is, but it really isn't. Here is the the first portion of the distal convoluted tubule. Remember, the distal convoluted tubule comes back to your own glomerulus, and that's what you're seeing there. Now, this whole area where you have an afferent arteriole, we'll put afferent arteriole plus that little portion of the distal convoluted tubule plus the efferent arteriole, that's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, or the JGA. And you'll learn about that in the physiology portion. But this whole area is called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And you're going to learn things about granular cells and macula-densa cells when you learn more about the physiology. All right, I'm just trying to make sure I haven't left anything off my list. All right, so just one more model to kind of show you. Again, I have different models. Here will be the capsule, the lighter colors, the cortex. Here's a renal pyramid. Here's one of those minor calyx. Here's a minor calyx. Here's a minor. They're going to join together to form a major and a major. Here's the renal pelvis. Here's the ureter, artery, and vein. And you can see your interlobular arteries and veins here. Another model, just one more shot to look at, so I'll let you guys look at that one and label it. It's the same as we've been looking at before, and just again one more model just to let you know that we have several different models, so you want to spend some time identifying those structures for the exam. I did put another diagram, so just to go back over that glomerulus, I've got everything listed for you. Here's your afferent arteriole, your efferent arteriole. You can see the actual glomerulus in here covered by these podocytes. You can see that this is where the distal convoluted tubule comes back to its own glomerulus. It's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus. I've talked to you about that. So on the models, if you see a thickened section that's closest to this area, these are the macula-densa cells. These are your sensor cells. You can see glomerular space here, and then again proximal convoluted tubule. So I did you a really big favor. I put this in the same orientation as the model, so you can just go back and forth between the image and the model and identify these structures. So again, afferent arteriole, efferent arteriole, whole thing is the JGA. This thickened area here is the macula densa. This is the last, kind of the first part of the distal convoluted tubule right here. Now let me say one thing. Some books say that this is the last section of the loop of Henle, and some say it's the first section of the distal convoluted tubule. It's right really at that transition point. Okay, so I call it the first part of the distal convoluted tubule. In some places they'll say that it's the last part of the loop of Henle. So on a test, if you said first part of distal convoluted tubule or last part of loop of Henle, I would give it to you because really it's that transition. Or you could put transition between the distal convoluted tubule and the loop of Henle, and I would know that you knew that it's really right there at that transition point. So if you look here, these brown things are the podocytes. The actual glomerulus, capillaries make up that whole area. You have your space, your glomerular space here, glomerular capsule, proximal convoluted tubule here. Just another version, afferent, efferent. There's your distal convoluted tubule making the JGA. You have your glomerulus, the whole thing, and then it's surrounded by these podocytes, space, capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, and then one more. So I'm not going to identify this one. I bet you can do it. And if you can't, I'm sure you can go find on the internet a labeled copy. One more time, a blown up version of those individual nephrons. The nephrons are in white. You can see these vasa recta. That's the paratubular capillaries. You can see the glomerular capsule. You can see an actual glomerulus here. You can see the afferent arteriole going into the glomerulus, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, distal convoluted tubule going into the collecting duct. So you should be able to identify all those structures. The collecting ducts all come together to form the renal papilla, and that drains into a minor calyx. Same picture I showed you earlier, just a little bit bigger so you could maybe see it a little bit better and maybe practice identifying things. And just another one so you can see it a little bit bigger and identify things as well. And that's it. So I've tried to give you a lot of different versions of those models and have them blown up to make it easier for you to actually identify things. So again, get on the Google, watch Mr. Graham's video, and I think you'll be fine. It really just is not that much stuff. Okay, I really did the same thing over and over and over again. Alrighty, that's it. Thanks a lot. See you in the next lab video.